In the year 2002, Gabrielle and Ken Edelman launched an independent photo project with the goal of documenting the entirety of California's coastline. The married couple flew a helicopter along the coast, taking photos every 500 feet. With the exception of some images of a military base, the photos were published online as the California Coastal Records Project. This was pretty exciting stuff for the internet in 2002, and it was considered a really valuable resource for researchers, environmentalists, and policymakers. The following year, the esteemed songstress Barbra Streisand sued the project for publishing a photo of her Malibu beach house. She lost the suit, but what she gained was a ton of attention, specifically on this photo. Because of the lawsuit, the photo in question was published by all sorts of mainstream press, which elevated it quite a bit beyond an online photo database for environmentalists. This phenomenon, drawing attention to something by trying to keep it quiet, has come to be known as the Streisand effect. And there's something similar happening today, except it seems to be done intentionally. Miss Streisand didn't want people to see the photo, and she had nothing to gain from it. But that's kind of the opposite of what we've been seeing in popular culture lately. There's a certain element of so-called cancel culture, where those most bothered by a piece of art provide a bunch of free publicity for whomever it is they're mad at. But unlike the Streisand effect, those making the most noise actually seem to have the most to gain. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a celebrated author and journalist, best known for his works about the Black experience in the United States. He spent 10 years at The Atlantic, both as senior editor and national correspondent. His most well-read work from his time at The Atlantic was The Case for Reparations, a 2014 feature article on systemic racism and the legacy of housing discrimination. The article was named Top Work of Journalism of the Decade by New York University's School of Journalism, and even led to Coates being invited to testify before Congress on the issue of reparations. He's also published 2 autobiographical books, an anthology of Obama-era essays, and even a fantasy novel. This dude's prolific, and not only that, but he's been writing for Marvel Comics for the past 5 years. He started writing the mainline Black Panther series in 2016, and 2 years later started writing Captain America as well. And I've only read a couple of his Black Panther books, but I like them pretty well. He introduced a narrative wherein T'Challa discovers that Wakandans actually colonized the indigenous inhabitants of the African continent. I thought it was a nice twist that subverted the notion that Wakanda was some idyllic black nation unstained by the sins of colonialism. Anyway, like I mentioned, Ta-Nehisi Coates has been writing Captain America since 2018. These I haven't read at all, because Captain America just doesn't do it for me. And although I'm into comics, I'm not into comics, and I definitely don't subscribe to the latest comics because A, I don't want to have paper copies, and B, the archives on Marvel Unlimited are surprisingly limited. So I probably would have never seen Captain America Volume 9, Issue 28. Except I did see some of it, because Mr. Jordan B. Peterson tweeted out several panels from it. You see, one of Captain America's most well-known adversaries is Red Skull, who is basically like a mutant super Nazi. And Coates took Red Skull in a new direction, one that in fact sounded a lot like a certain Canadian self-help author. Now, if you know anything about the self-help field, you probably know that it's basically one step removed from pseudoscience. Self-help tends to range from innocuous truisms to straight-up fraud. Now, we could argue that Peterson could be in the innocuous truisms camp, with his 12 rules for life, including such gems of wisdom as do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, and be precise in your speech. Except, one of his 12 rules is to set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And if you've ever listened to a Peterson lecture or interview, you know he fucking hates the world.
Here's a question. Can men and women work together in the workplace?
Yes, I do it.
How do you know?
Because I work with a lot of women.
Right. Well, it's been happening for 40 years? And things are deteriorating very rapidly at the moment in terms of the relationships between men and women.
And despite his love of criticizing the world, Peterson's house is far from in perfect order. Now, I'm not one to denigrate a person for their mental illness, but considering Peterson has built a quite lucrative career on self-improvement, I think it's worth looking at how spectacularly he has failed to improve himself. In 2018, Peterson embarked on an all-beef diet to help with his depression. Around this same time, Peterson began suffering from benzo addiction. And let me be clear, that sucks. It really does, and I want to feel empathy for the man. But again, he has literally made millions on the idea that virtually any of your problems can be fixed through personal responsibility. So, naturally, he does what any wealthy intellectual with access to the Canadian healthcare system would do. He goes to Moscow, where he enters a medically induced coma for 8 days. And a few months later, he and his family all moved to Belgrade for different addiction treatment. Did I mention this all took place during the COVID-19 pandemic? Because yes, Jordan Peterson did contract coronavirus somewhere between Canada, Russia, and Serbia. And that may or may not have been related to his daughter's refusal to take any safety precautions while in Europe. And let me reiterate, COVID sucks, addiction sucks, depression sucks. But Jordan Peterson's whole brand is take care of yourself. And historically, he seems unable to do so. So it is absolutely fair to call this man a con artist. He's made millions by selling advice that he himself does not follow, which makes Peterson little more than a self-help grifter. And I guess you could say a hyper self-help grifter could be described as a cult leader. And if you turned a cult leader up to 100, you'd be left with a fascist.
If authority is misused, it looks like power, and misused power is tyranny.
And yeah, going from self-help grifter to fascist is a bit of a stretch, but also like this is a discussion about a fantasy strongman picture book. And for a writer known for his work on contemporary racism, maybe Coates asked himself, how would Red Skull recruit young people in the 21st century? Well, maybe a bit like Jordan Peterson, an eccentric college professor with millions of online followers, whose own colleague and mentor described Peterson as a preacher more than a teacher, who's made a career selling Stand Up Straight to the tune of 3 million books sold. And, also selling cultural Marxism, which is just a conspiracy theory about how Marxists, after failing to win the Western economy, are now trying to take over Western culture.
And then what happened was the postmodernists came onto the scene, and they were all Marxists. But they couldn't be Marxists anymore because you couldn't be a Marxist and claim that you were a human being by the end of the 1960s. And so they started to play a sleight of hand. And instead of pitting the proletariat, the working class, against the bourgeoisie, they started to pit the oppressor, the oppressed against the oppressor. And that opened up the avenue to identifying any number of groups as oppressed and oppressor, and to continue the same narrative under a different name. It was no longer specifically about economics. It was about power.
It used to be called cultural Bolshevism, which was the same thing, except the Marxists were Bolsheviks. And that came from Jewish Bolshevism, which was the same thing, except now the Bolsheviks are Jewish and they're trying to take over.
One of the things I've always thought about Hitler is that, people, you have to admire Hitler. That's the thing. Because he was an organizational genius.
Oh yeah, maybe it's not that weird that Red Skull would employ similar tactics to Peterson. But I was curious. I bought a few recent issues of Captain America, including number 28. I was ready for some blood sports. Let me see Ta-Nehisi Coates rip Jordan Peterson a new one. Oh. It's one panel. One panel directly references Peterson's work. And it's not even part of the direct linear narrative. It's just like a vague flashback image. In the rest of the issue, and even the preceding issues, Red Skull is just a generic far-right online personality. Like, Jordan Peterson is not even part of this issue, except as a punchline. And that's really my point. You've got a left-wing author who's been writing Captain America for 3 years now, and after hundreds of pages, he happens to lampoon a right-wing...
I'm not right-wing.
self-help millionaire most famous for flying to Eastern Europe in the middle of a pandemic to get experimental treatment for his pill addiction. Like, that really is not that surprising. But Mr. Peterson drew a ton of attention to it. And don't you know it, it's just those dang Marxists taking over Western culture again. Like, it's not enough that he's mad at a publisher and their author. He goes and spins it into his omnibus conspiracy theory about leftists destroying our culture.
It shocked me to begin with. I couldn't believe it to begin with, especially when I found out who the author of the comic book was. So, he's an intellectual figure among the leftist community, relatively well known, and politically correct.
I said certified freak 7 days a week. Wet ass P-word. Make that pullout game weak. Yeah, you effin' with some wet ass P-word. P-word is female genitalia.
This song was huge. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard chart and was named Best Song of 2020 by Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, and NPR. Now, I'm not saying Republican Conservative helped get this song to #1, because let's be real, it's a bop. The song would have been just fine on its own, but the manufactured controversy helped transform it from a raunchy club hit to a defiant anthem of two women's sexuality. But that was a year ago. This year's biggest contender for most controversial pop song is far less objectionable, yet it seems to have generated even more controversy. Because now, instead of degrading society through sexuality, black musicians are degrading society through Satan and sexuality as well. But I think there's a bit of a difference. Now, Montero, Call Me By Your Name, is a banger. Let's get that out of the way. But until now, Lil Nas X was still a fairly young artist. Before WAP, Cardi B was already iconic. She is arguably one of the biggest women musicians in the history of pop music. She's had a bunch of #1s, 5 Guinness records, a Best Rap Album Grammy. Like I said, iconic. There was no question that WAP was going to top the charts once again. Montero is a bit different. Like I said, Lil Nas X hadn't really broken through to iconic status. Granted, his song Old Town Road spent 19 weeks at #1, but that was his only #1 to date, and he'll only be releasing his first full-length album later this year. Montero wasn't a sure shot like WAP was. It was a risk. A rapper who's best known for a pseudo-novelty country hip-hop song, releasing a flamenco/reggaeton/half-sung, half-rapped song about a gay relationship. I'm just saying, it wasn't guaranteed success in the same way that a sexy club hit by two of the year's biggest rappers was. But then the video dropped. It's a gorgeous video, directed by Ta-Nehisi and Lil Nas X, and it follows a 3-part story. The video starts in the Garden of Eden, where Montero is tempted by the serpent into doing some gay stuff. Then, Montero is tried in court and subsequently stoned to death. He starts to ascend to heaven, but ultimately slides down a pole to hell, where he gives Satan just an incredible lap dance. Then he kills Satan and claims his crown. Wow. Good job. Good video. Fun song, sexy dance, provocative imagery, like music videos sometimes have. And it's got a nice message about a gay man trying to live his life authentically in spite of society's condemnation. Except, oh no, the video depicts a fictional bad guy, which means this black artist is corrupting the youth with devil music. Who could have seen this coming?
What are the main themes of rock music? When I went through my own record collection, I was shocked. Isn't sex a major theme? And the occult too? And what about the lifestyles of the popular groups and artists? Some are admitted homosexuals.
And that's how you know this is clearly just puritanical pearl clutching. Oh no, this black musician is making provocative music. Think of the children. You don't have to like it, but it's a little dramatic to suggest that it's hurting society. I can't help but believe that all the right-wing outrage we saw really helped propel this song to iconic status. And this is anecdotal, but I probably wouldn't have been so motivated to seek out the video if it weren't for all the controversy. And now, what was once simply a banger has become an important focal point in the culture wars. In 2021, the year of our Lord, Dr. Seuss Enterprises made the decision to stop publishing and selling 6 of Dr. Seuss's books. The company claimed to do so because these books portray people in ways that are hurtful and wrong. And if there's one thing we know right-wingers hate, it's when private companies make decisions about what products they want to sell. No, that's not it. They hate being told that something is racist, that's it.
As a society, we're acting like children, like a child who's in charge, who doesn't like peas. So he says, let's ban peas. Anybody eating peas or growing peas shall be killed.
And let's be honest, this is some pretty scary stuff. I mean, what's next? Microsoft stops selling Windows 98? Nintendo stops selling Ogre Battle 64 Person of Lordly Caliber? And if you're watching this in the future and you don't know about Ogre Battle 64 Person of Lordly Caliber, it might just be too late. But seriously, a company choosing to stop producing a certain product must happen every day. And the reasoning is almost always, it's not making us money. And call me cynical, but if we were to evaluate this from a strictly marketing standpoint, they announced the decision on Dr. Seuss's birthday, which is a holiday celebrated by schools and libraries. They appear to be making a progressive decision by taking accountability for their products, and they made a shit ton of money.
Children's books are now dominating Amazon's bestseller list, flying up the list. 9 of the top 10 are all by Dr. Seuss, so you see how that works.
The right-wing outrage machine is so predictable that I can't imagine they didn't expect this reaction. The Dr. Seuss Enterprises stopped selling some of their books was quickly transformed into radical woke mob, cancel beloved and totally not racist children's author Dr. Seuss. And even though that's not what happened, the very appearance of being canceled lit a fire under all sorts of folks who wanted to get Cat in the Hat while they still can. Which is to say, forcing right-wingers to fabricate negative press has now become a legitimate business strategy.
You know what? At first, when I first thought about this, when I first had the idea for like, okay, I'm putting this video out Friday. As it got closer, I was like kind of anxious. And I was just like, you know what? I'm going to put this out and then I'm going to leave the internet for like a week. And then I was like, you know, I'm not. I'm going to put this out and I'm going to milk the shit out of this. I want to have fun with it too.
Lil Nas X released his video, which is really not terribly offensive unless you're a whiny little snowflake. And he knew he would get backlash. But he also almost certainly realized that the controversy would sell records. And Jordan Peterson, who is beloved by the far right, couldn't have been surprised when a prominent black thinker made a joke likening him to a literal Nazi. And surely he knew complaining about it would just bring more eyes to Ta-Nehisi's work. But he also probably understood that he could make headlines simply by retweeting a couple images from the book. And those headlines would invigorate his fan base, and maybe even bring him new recruits, or customers.
Anyways, as soon as I read it, I was like, okay, we can use this. Merch time.
Oh look, they started selling pseudo-fascist merch. And then we have Dr. Seuss, who was canceled by his own estate, reportedly for being too offensive for today's cultural standards. And the right-wing outrage machine hated that. They got so mad that a private company would stop selling books that they hadn't thought about in decades. But that begs the question, why are they pushing the same behavior on things they find offensive? If we take these folks at face value, we could be certain that they would be happy for Lil Nas X and Ta-Nehisi Coates to have a come to Jesus moment, where they realize their sins and unpublish their terribly offensive music video and comic book. Which of course would just result in the very thing they claim to hate, a monoculture dictated by the pundit class, where challenging and uncomfortable ideas are unwelcome. And that brings us back to cultural Marxism, you know, those dang communists taking over our culture. Setting aside the fact that this was literally a Nazi talking point, the idea is on its face silly. This fear of Marxists taking over education and the arts has been around since the 40s, and 80 years later, we don't even have universal healthcare. But I've been thinking about it, and I'm wondering if Peterson has been telling on himself with this theory. The Nazis and other fascists were no fan of degenerate art pushed by the communists, but you can't be a Nazi these days. So you drop the fascist politics, and what are you left with? Culture. And to bring it all back around, yes, this is basically how Red Skull operates in the latest comics. And let's be real, the Jordan Petersons of the world would absolutely love a society where their ideas are the culture, but even that would present a problem. Without gay rappers and leftist authors to rail against, they'd be forced to sell their own ideas, which, again, not very good.
So there's no real evidence that what was wrong with the Nazis was that they weren't civilized. There's more evidence, actually, I think, that they were too civilized, and I'll talk to you about that later.
So we're left with this kind of cultural parasite, one whose MO is simply to leech attention off more popular, more profitable, and more capable creators, to take advantage of this bizarro Streisand effect. Right-wing reactionaries know exactly what they're doing. They know they're only pumping up the satanic black gay communists, but ultimately, they need the satanic black gay communists. Because if the postmodern radical leftists make more money, then so do they.
And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem.